finish our series, David. These last 3 weeks, we have stepped into parts of David's life. When he was a shepherd boy, a giant slayer, a mighty warrior, and now a man rejected and on the run. And through all the hurt, rejection, and pain, David takes matters into his own hands again and again. But through all this, David is learning where he must always place his hope. Perhaps the greater measure of someone's maturity is how they handle authority or power and influence. In other words, how we respond when it dawns on us that we are the most important or powerful person in the room, whether it's in the classroom, the community, at work, or in our home. It's that time when you realize that all eyes are on you, and you alone are the one who needs to make the decision. And what you do in that moment will say so much about you. Because the greatest reflection of your individual maturity is what you do with your influence, your power, and your authority. It's very disturbing when we see someone leverage their influence, authority, and power for their own benefit and neglect the people they're responsible for, the very people who have chosen to follow them. But on the other hand, what's more inspiring than to see a leader who denies themselves for the very sake of the people they're responsible for? We see this in people we support, like maybe a boss or a supervisor, someone in the military, maybe the police, a fireman. Or we see this in parents who say no to themselves for their children's benefit. The thing is, I don't think any of us really know what lever we will pull or what button we will push until someone actually gives us those keys. Or in David's case, till he gets the crown. And this brings us to part 4 of David. When David was a young boy, Samuel the prophet shows up at his home, and he tells Jesse, his father, this: I come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. But the real reason Samuel is there is because God has sent him to anoint the next king of Israel. Samuel invites Jesse and his family to eat with him. When Jesse and his sons arrived, Samuel saw Eliab, the oldest, and thought, surely this is the man who God has chosen. That was easy. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. In other words, only God knows the heart. After 6 of Jesse's sons appear before Samuel, still no king. And by now, Samuel is thinking, have I missed something? So Samuel asks Jesse again, are these all the sons you have? I know I told you to invite your family, but are these all your sons? Jesse looks around and he realizes that one is missing. Jesse answered, no, I have another son, my youngest, but he is out taking care of the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. Bring him here. We won't sit down to eat until he arrives. Now let's pause here for a moment and just imagine if this was you. Someone comes to your house, wants to take you to dinner. Then after meeting your family, he looks around and asks, is there any more? And you realize that your youngest boy is out with friends. And this person tells you he needs to meet him before you can go and eat. So you send someone to go get him. He's only 13, so there's no telling where he could be. And by now, everyone is really hungry and ready to go. And for those of us who can remember being 13, or for those of us who have a 13-year-old boy, you know it's not going to take just a few minutes. Probably more like hours. Finally, David shows up. The Lord said to Samuel, get up and anoint him. He's the one. So Samuel walks over to David and pours the special oil he brought over his head in front of all his brothers. Then Samuel says, let's eat. And we can just imagine the look on everyone's face. In fact, one of the brothers say, well, that's Samuel. He always does crazy stuff like that. The scripture ends with Samuel going home to Ramah. However, it also tells us this. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, And about 2 years later is when David kills Goliath. For 7 years, David is in good standing with the king. He marries the king's daughter, and Jonathan becomes his best friend, but then things start to change. And after 7 years, the king feels threatened and becomes very jealous of David. And as we heard last week, he decides to kill David. So David becomes a fugitive. In fact, David was on the run for 8 more years. But throughout those 8 years, David learned some very important lessons. And probably the most valuable lesson David learns is this. This is not about me. It's all about God's will, God's way, and God's time. And David experiences this the most when he had 2 opportunities to kill Saul. On one of those occasions, he finds out where Saul and his army are camped out. And David decides to go into the camp during the night for a closer look. In fact, he and Abishai manage to reach the king's tent, and they go inside. They find Saul asleep with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner, his bodyguard, is sleeping nearby. Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy in your hands. You had the chance before and you waited. Now God has given you the chance again. Look, we're standing in the middle of the king's army, and no one has detected us." How God is that? And if you can't kill him, I can. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. But David stops him. Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? We must wait on the Lord. I refuse to interfere with the will of God in order to receive the promises of God. However, we can do something another way. Take the spear and water jug that are near his head and let's go. And they leave the camp unnoticed and head up to the hill to wait for the sun to rise. And as the sun is coming up, David shouts out to Abner, the king's bodyguard, "Abner, are you missing something? Why didn't you guard the king?" And silhouetted against the rising sun on top of the hill is David, holding up the king's spear and his water jug. Then he leaves the king's spear on the hill and vanishes into the desert with his men. Why? Because David refused to replace what God had put in place. David knew he must wait for God's will, God's way, and God's time. Eventually, King Saul and Jonathan are killed by the Philistines. The 2 men that stood in the way of David becoming king were now gone. The scripture tells us that when David hears the news, instead of throwing a victory party, instead of celebrating, David mourns. Soon afterwards, the tribe of Judah declared David their king. Now there was another son of King Saul, and he was declared king over the other 11 tribes of Israel. And so for 7 more long years, there was a conflict between the house of David, with King David of Judah, and with the house of Saul, with King Ishbosheth, over the other 11 tribes. And the people under King David wanted him to claim all of it. You should be king over all the tribes. But David declined. David refused to replace what God had put in place. He waited on God's will, God's way, and God's time. And this goes on for 7 more years, until one day, 2 men murder Ishbosheth. They think they have done David a great service. They have removed the last obstacle keeping David from becoming king over the entire nation of Israel. But here's what happened. Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. And these guys are expecting a great reward for doing this for David. But David reacts like this. As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death. That is the reward I gave him for his news. And unfortunately, they received the same reward. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb in Hebron. After being a fugitive for 8 years, and at war with the house of Saul for 7 more years, the time had now come for all the tribes to declare David as king over the entire nation of Israel. They all knew David had the power and the influence. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people, Israel, and you will become their ruler. All the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron. Hebron was the place where David was to be crowned the king of Israel. And this was also the place where David would show his true greatness. This is the moment David would apply everything he had learned in the wilderness. He is about to hold all of Israel in his hands. He already had the influence. He already was the most powerful person in the room, even without the crown. And in that moment, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron. David makes a covenant with the people, something he didn't need to do. He was now the king, and his word was law. And not just that, many of these elders were the very ones who made his life so miserable for 8 years. He could have easily taken revenge on them in that moment. But instead, David makes a covenant with the people. Why? The last 3 words in this scripture explain it all. Before the Lord. David recognized in public that he would be a king under authority. And in that moment, David submitted himself to God's law, which meant as a leader, he was submitting himself to the people in which he ruled. And this was David's way of saying, I am a king, but not the king. Even with all of David's bad decisions, even with all his flaws, David never confused himself with the king of Israel. And they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. David waited 15 years for what God had promised him. And it wasn't an easy 15 years. And during that time, he learned some valuable lessons that would make him a great king. He learned that leadership is a stewardship. And even kings are accountable. 1,000 years later, only 20 miles from Hebron, in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus would model this kind of greatness. But there would be a twist to it. And the Apostle John, who was there, gives us an eyewitness account of what Jesus did. It was just before the Passover festival. This would be the last time Jesus would celebrate the Passover with his disciples. John writes this, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. He knew that just hours from now, he would be arrested, condemned, and crucified by the very people he came to save. And like David, he was anointed by God but not recognized. And like David, he would issue a new covenant only through his own blood. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. He had the power without the crown. He has the authority without the title. Jesus held everything in his hands. And John tells us what he does in that moment. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And he prepares to do something he's not required to do at all. In fact, servants are assigned to do this. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And when he was finished, he said this, Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. When someone hands you the keys, when you get the opportunity of a lifetime, in those moments when you think you're really something, when you think you're really somebody, what you do in those moments will say so much about you. Because in some way or form, someone has handed you the keys. And you have a title because you wear a crown for someone. Maybe you're a father, a mother, a wife, a husband, a boss, a caretaker, a grandmother, a grandpa, a teacher, a manager, an owner, a captain of a team, a coach, a big brother or sister, the president, a board member, a chairperson. You have been given authority. David gives us an example, and this is what Jesus modeled for us. And this is what's required of a disciple. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Imagine if leaders lived this way. Imagine if everyone lived this way. Through our years of ministry, one of the things that Scott and I have learned to ask to help us see clearly is this question: what does Christ's love require of me? And we have found that when we ask this question in every situation, you will see things through the eyes of Christ. And it will give you a different vantage point in seeing your situation. Because by asking this question, the love of Christ will have you leverage your power for the benefit of the other people in the room. And the love of Christ will have you leverage your power for the benefit of a relationship in that room. May we remember the example of David and the model of Jesus in the areas of life where when we're given those keys. Let us pray.